Greetings, friends and countrymen. Welcome to Conspiracy Corner News special episode. We have a second interview. You can call it part 2 with Joseph McBride. He's an American historian, biographer, screenwriter, and professor in the cinema department at San Francisco State University. McBride has published 18 books since 1968, including acclaimed biographies of Frank Capra, John Ford, and Steven Spielberg. His most recent work is Two Cheers for Hollywood, which we'll be talking about. And he has also done a lot of research on the President John F. Kennedy killing and of Officer Tippit, which we talked about last time being one of the forgotten murders of the day. Both of them contain really good insight and new information. The New York Times Book of Reviews causes JFK investigation a great knowledge of social and American history. Thank you, Joseph, for joining us. How are you doing out there in San Francisco?
Well, very good, Bob. Great to be on the show with you and Bart. Good to talk to you.
And then Bob Wilson. He's an historian out in Long Island, New York. How are you doing?
It's an honor to be speaking to you two gentlemen today on such a serious subject.
Well, I'll let you start off, Bob. What is your first question you'd have for Joseph?
Well, Joseph's books have made me think. Not only his books sometimes can be on different subjects, but in a consciousness they can link together. And one thing he said to start the show was that I believe he was speaking of Freud, and he said what you're afraid to speak of, or what you don't speak of, is the elephant in the room. And I'd like to start the show off and kick it to you two gentlemen, because you've both spoken on these subjects, but it actually frightens me. The thing I'm afraid to speak about is these wars. Many of them seem to have been started under false pretenses, or a plan that seems to have been hatched before the war started, and it started with the WMDs. And I must admit, when those things were being bandied around, I was afraid, and I thought if that was true, it is a just war, and we should do something about it. So I'm not saying I was a genius, and I knew at the start that something was foul. And I'm just wondering, as these wars continue, and now they speak of Korea, and they speak of China and Russia, and these things going on. I know Joseph and yourself have studied this for so long, and that combined with, being afraid to speak about it, which is sort of, hey, we need to be in your computer, we need to be on your phone, we need to not only open your mail as in Hoover's days. I think you follow my train of thought. And I'd like to kick it to you two and just ask, where are they going with this? Is this just a train going off the tracks, or does someone in some sick way, are they pulling the strings and leading us towards some kind of a war that we'd like to... most of us in humanity would like to avoid, that reminds me very much of the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, I was reminded again of Hermann Goering's famous quote during the Nuremberg trials. The Nazi Air Force chief, Luftwaffe, said that the common people in any country really don't want a war, and you have to get them to go along with it. And he said it's very easy to get them to go along with it. You just tell them we're under attack, and you attack the pacifists as disloyal, and pretty much you get everybody on your side right away, which is what has happened over and over again in my lifetime. I was born right after World War II, and I'm too young to remember the Korean War, but Vietnam War, was fought under false pretenses, and pretty much everything we've done since, you find out that it was some kind of event was rigged, like the Gulf of Tonkin in the Vietnam, and then the weapons of mass destruction, and 9/11. All these things have problems connected to them, and we're still fighting in Afghanistan, the longest war in our history, which makes no sense at all. Although the New York Times a few years ago did a very revealing story that people sort of missed, that the reason we're in Afghanistan is that they have a tremendous amount of minerals there, including lithium, which is in your laptops and batteries. And that's why we're there. And we're usually, throughout human history, there have been a couple of reasons for wars. One is to steal the materials and the goods of other countries, and the other is to take land. And taking land is no longer as big a motive as it used to be, although, we're controlling Afghanistan as much as we can. Although I heard a speech by one of the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff a few years ago, saying that there's no way to win a war in Afghanistan. The last person who did it was Alexander the Great. And he said basically it's not really a unified country. It's 27 different tribes, and the terrain is extremely difficult. And so you can't really win these wars. And I have a friend who's a veteran in Iraq, and he said his commander actually told the guys, we're not here to win this war, we're just here to hold on. So we don't win wars anymore, and we don't even try. That's a strange, antiquated concept that World War II was the last war we really won, and we lost the Korean War, if you look at it from a strategic point of view. And it's interesting, World War II is also the last war we declared, and the reason that's in the Constitution is to get the public to support it. Why go to war if the public isn't behind it? Of course, then you can bring up the Goering argument. But in World War II, there was really a cause for it, and the public rallied behind it. It was a just war, but we haven't had one since.
Let me ask you about the Gulf of Tonkin. Tell us about that. I think a lot of people may not be aware of that, and also tell us about when that information was confirmed by the government itself.
Well, in '64, they were really gearing up for a war, and John F. Kennedy had actually started withdrawing troops from Vietnam. He realized that it was an unwinnable situation, so in the fall of '63, he actually issued an order to withdraw 1,000 troops, and he was telling his advisors that he would pull all the troops out after he won re-election in '64. But Johnson reversed Kennedy's policy on November 24th, '63, secretly, while the public was filing past Kennedy's coffin in the Capitol. Johnson was having a secret meeting and issued a secret presidential order to expand the war, not to withdraw. And he started putting out the word to McNamara and other people. That's what he was going to do, and that's why he was put in office. The people who supported him, the Texas oil people and defense contractors who were his backers, made a lot of money off the war. And Noam Chomsky wrote a book that attacks Kennedy. It's kind of wrong-headed in some ways, but he said that the conventional wisdom that we lost the Vietnam War is wrong, in the sense that the people who backed it made a lot of money off it, and that's from their perspective, they did really well. They won. Millions of people died, but they don't care about that, and so they always have that kind of a split going on. So the Gulf of Tonkin episode in August of '64 was a fake episode that they were looking for an excuse to widen the war more overtly, and they were sending provocative ship missions toward the coast of North Vietnam, hoping for some kind of incident. And they reported that there was some kind of a firing going on of North Vietnamese firing on an American ship, and it turned out not to be true. There was some confusion about it, and it was later confirmed. I'm not sure exactly when this was all revealed to the public that it was fake, but it was quite some time afterwards, because Johnson was deceiving the public for years. That was part of the credibility gap, as we called it back then, that the public eventually realized they were being conned, and there was no real good reason for us to be fighting in Vietnam. It was mainly another economic thing, and it was cloaked in various patriotic rationales, such as defending treaties, etc. But it was all just to get money for the war contractors, just like people said about World War I. So the Gulf of Tonkin was a fraud, but the Congress passed a resolution, and only 2 senators, Greening and Morris, voted against it. A lot of them realized they'd been conned. So it wasn't a declaration of war. We never had a declaration of war in Vietnam, but it gave Johnson some authority to expand the war, which he began doing. In March of '65, he landed the Marines in Da Nang, and then it became much more overt from that point on.
Well, your expertise is in films, and I know you've done a book about Capra, and Capra was definitely, he was I believe, a World War II veteran, and he was contracted by Hollywood to make pro-military industrial complex film. So tell us about how the military industrial complex uses Hollywood, uses filmmakers to promote their war agenda.
Yeah, I've done 2 biographies about guys who had major roles in World War II, John Ford and Frank Capra. Ford was with the OSS, the predecessor of the CIA, and the Navy. He was in the Navy as well. And he made a lot of training films and reconnaissance films and secret combat films, most of which were not seen until, well, just in recent years. You can see them now at the National Archives and on YouTube, but they were, most people didn't even know about what he was doing. He made The Battle of Midway, which was a great combat film. He was actually there filming it, and that film was shown in theaters. Capra was in the Army, and he made a lot of training films. They were supposed to be training films, the Why We Fight series, for the troops to show them, because they were, a lot of troops only had a high school education or less, and they really didn't know much about the world situation. So General George C. Marshall, the Chief of Staff, directed Capra to make these films. They weren't ordered by Hollywood, these were ordered by Washington, but they recruited Hollywood people to make them because Marshall, for example, was a great fan of films, and he realized that film was a great tool of persuasion. Most leaders realized that, you know, Lenin and Churchill and Stalin and Hitler, all these, Roosevelt, all these leaders knew that film was the greatest medium of persuasion for the masses. So they got these 2 great filmmakers and other Hollywood filmmakers like John Huston, William Wyler, etc. There's been a lot of attention on this recently. There was a series called 5 Came Back based on a book by Mark Harris. And so I did long chapters on in my searching for John Ford and Frank Capra, The Catastrophe of Success, analyzing their films. And I discovered a lot of their films in the National Archives that nobody even knew about. And they're really interesting films, and they're propaganda to some extent, although Ford's were, since they weren't designed for the public as much, they're not as much propaganda as kind of talking directly to other military people. Capra's films were flag-waving propaganda, but he made quite a variety of films. He made one called The Negro Soldier, which was intended both to show African Americans why they had a stake in the war, which they were dubious about, and to show white soldiers and civilians that black soldiers would make good soldiers and had a strong contribution to make. And he made other films. Know Your Enemy, Japan is a shockingly racist film demonizing the Japanese. And so the Capra films are kind of a mix. But in recent years, there have been studies about how the CIA and the military have, in a very organized way, penetrated Hollywood. They have offices in Hollywood that are very vigorous in providing support for films and television shows that back the official military-industrial complex themes. And, you know, one of the things that's always happened with Hollywood films is to save money and to get access to authentic ships and airplanes and things, they need cooperation from the military. Apocalypse Now couldn't get cooperation, so they had to do it on their own. It cost an awful lot of money, but it was a more honest film. And so occasionally there's a film that doesn't take the military contribution, but usually they do. And there are all kinds of caveats involved. They censor the scripts, and you know, sometimes they'll just say you can't do that project, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of what we see is sometimes the most effective propaganda is stuff you don't think is propaganda. You think it's just entertainment, but it's propaganda.
Well, you know, to tell you the truth, I've been watching on YouTube Gomer Pyle USMC, which was going on during the Vietnam War. And they never talk about war. They never mention it. They're always on base, you know, sweeping up the barracks. You know, it's a brilliant show, and it's very well written and very well performed, and great directors. And yet, it's kind of odd. There it is in the middle of the Vietnam War, and they never mention it once.
That's interesting. Well, you know, my father was in World War II, and his favorite show was Sergeant Bilko, which I think is the best sitcom ever on television. And he thought that was completely authentic to his service. He was a sergeant as well, and he was in South America and Central America, where we had a lot of troops because we were afraid that Nazis might try to take over, and also that they or the Japanese would seize the Panama Canal, which was a very serious concern. So nothing happened, but that nothing happened because they were there. So he said most of their time they were having a good time playing cards, trying to outwit the top brass, etc., just like in Bilko. And he said that was just a perfect show. So that's kind of a subversive program, I guess you could say, in the 50s. But then you had MASH, which was a kind of anti-war show. There was a taboo in Hollywood against depicting the Vietnam War while it was happening, except for John Wayne with his ludicrous Green Berets film. It was like this unspoken thing. They just could not show it until Coppola broke the taboo with Apocalypse Now. And then there were a lot of interesting Vietnam films made after that. Oliver Stone, who was a veteran in Vietnam, made some of the best, of course, Platoon, Born on the 4th of July, etc. And then he examined in JFK and Nixon some of the causes of the war. So there have been a lot of interesting war films. And one of the things that's happened in recent years is there are serious films about the current wars that we've been in since 9/11, but the public generally doesn't go to see them. Like The Hurt Locker is a good film, won the Academy Award for Best Picture, but the box office was very minimal. The public is not interested in seeing the stark, grim face of war. In wartime, and this happened in World War II as well, they went to see comedies and musicals and things during the war. It's sort of a myth. We kind of think they're all going to war movies, but war movies were kind of a hard sell during the war, and theater exhibitors were complaining. People didn't want to see newsreels and propaganda films, and there weren't as many war movies made as we think. And so today, we're not seeing the public flocking as much to war movies as perhaps they should. It's interesting. When I started teaching full-time in 2002 at San Francisco State, the students were very obsessed with realism. They kept talking about, is this film realistic or not? I never hear that anymore. They aren't interested in realism because everything is fantasies and superheroes, and we've gone in that direction with our films. A lot of comedies, a lot of silly, romantic comedies, etc., but a lot of escapist films, and reality is not what they're interested in. And there was a line in Tennessee Williams' Streetcar Named Desire where a character says, I don't want realism, I want magic. And I think that kind of sums up the American public right now.
Tell us about your book, Two Cheers for Hollywood. What does it focus on?
Well, that's a collection of my short writing on films. Over 50 years, I've been writing on film since 1967 when I was in college, and publishing in a lot of magazines and newspapers. And so I collected this. It's a very big book, 695 pages, and it's quite a wide range of material because I'm pretty eclectic in my tastes. And I interviewed a lot of directors, George Stevens, John Ford, all kinds of people that I like. And I wrote about a lot of screenwriters, profiles of screenwriters, and visited sets of films like John Wayne's The Shootist and Bound for Glory, the film by Woody Guthrie. And then I wrote some essays on films. I wrote a piece on Let There Be Light, which is a John Huston World War II film that was banned for 35 years. It's about PTSD. It's a documentary on soldiers with what they then called neuropsychiatric disorder. It was called shell shock in World War I, and now it's a very common thing because a lot of people are coming back from our wars with PTSD. I asked one of my veteran friends, he said, how many of you guys have that? He said, well, we all do. And so Huston made this very powerful film on that subject, and I managed to liberate that film in 1980 with the help of Jack Valenti and Ray Stark. Got involved. I conducted a press campaign to try to free that film. Ron Haver, a friend of mine, showed the film at the LA County Museum of Art. It had never been shown in public. John Huston tried to show it in public in 1946, and Army MPs showed up with guns and took it away. So I thought it was time to get that out, and we managed to get it freed. So I wrote about the whole history of getting that film freed and why it was banned, and it's quite an interesting piece. I did some new research on it. So I cover a lot of topics, and I reprint some of my older articles that are, from a wide variety of publications that people may not have read. And then I have a lot of new things. I have a long profile of the Coen brothers, essay on their films. It's kind of like a monograph in the middle of this book. So it's kind of, my view of things. George Stevens made Shane, for example. I'm teaching a Western course in the fall, and starting with Shane, and he told me that was his war film. He was covering the war. He went through the invasion of Europe, and he was with the troops that went into Dachau, and that changed his whole life. I asked him how that changed him. He said, I don't suppose I was ever too hilarious again, because he had made comedies mostly before the war. And he said when he made Shane, that was his war film. Most people don't realize that, but he said, my friends are all making their war films, and I've been avoiding it. But, you know, it's a war film about, he said he wanted to debunk the mystique of six-shooters and guns and people killing each other, and everybody was firing cap guns and Westerns on television. And he saved the first gunshot in that film for quite a long time into it, and he fired off 2 cannons when Shane fires his gun, just to make the impression of how serious and dangerous just one gunshot can be.
Now, you also did extensive interviews with Orson Welles, correct?
Well, I was with him for 6 years acting in The Other Side of the Wind, which is coming out hopefully at the Cannes Film Festival in May. And I was an actor in that film. I had never acted before, and he put me in there playing kind of a comical version of myself, and I played up to it. I play a film critic who's following John Huston around, who's a legendary old director. He's the main character in the film, and it's his 70th birthday, and he's having a big party to try to get funding to finish an unfinished project he's been shooting called The Other Side of the Wind. And Wells cast a lot of people playing sort of comical, satirical versions of themselves, and I was one of them. And I interviewed him. The first day I met him, we had a long talk for about 3 hours, and I talked to him a lot during the shooting. I never formally interviewed him, actually. I never actually published an interview with him, but I've written 3 books on him. The last one, Whatever Happened to Orson Welles, A Portrait of an Independent Career, is kind of a memoir of my years with him, and I did other things with him and got to know him quite well.
What was his opinion of the military-industrial complex?
Well, he was a progressive. He suffered from blacklisting after the war. He fled America right at the time of the HUAC hearings in the fall of '47, and went to Europe and didn't really come back until 1956. He came back in '53 briefly to do a show on CBS. CBS was the only company that would hire him for a few years in America, but he was blacklisted because he was what they call a premature anti-fascist, which was the Orwellian term they used back then. If you were against the Nazis too early, you were a suspect. He was not a communist. The FBI tried hard to prove he was a communist, and they never could, because he was not a joiner, and he thought they were too doctrinaire. But he was very progressive in terms of racial issues and anti-fascist causes, and he lent his work to a lot of anti-fascist efforts. He made the Julius Caesar play in 1937, which was kind of a modern dress updating of the play to Mussolini and Hitler era. And Cradle of Rock was an anti-fascist pro-labor play, and Citizen Kane is very anti-fascist. And It's All True, the abortive documentary in South America he made for the U.S. government, it was intended to counter what I was mentioning, the efforts of the Nazis to encroach on the governments of South America. And but he was too progressive for the Brazilian and United States governments and RKO, because he was mingling black and white people in the film and criticizing poverty and exploitation, etc. So they terminated the film. And so he was a very political fellow. And we had an argument, though, when I first met him, about Lyndon Johnson. He thought he was a great president. And I said, well, you know, the Vietnam War was terrible destruction of his great society. And Wells became incensed because he was an old FDR liberal Democrat, and he correctly, you know, thought Johnson was great in the sense of bringing us Medicare and Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, and those were great achievements. But a lot of what he did was undone by the Vietnam War, but Wells just wouldn't hear about that. We had quite a harsh argument on that. I was covering the anti-war protests in Madison, Wisconsin, I was involved in those protests myself as a protester until I went to work for the Wisconsin State Journal. Then I was covering them. And they were getting very violent and nihilistic at the time. Students were setting buildings on fire and breaking windows, and the police were quite brutal. And I knew that it was leading up to something terrible. I told Wells that somebody was about to be killed. I said, the students are getting crazy. Somebody's going to be killed, and he got very upset. And then I flew back to Madison, and I asked a cab driver what's been happening since I've been away, and he said the students just blew up a building. This was 1970, and they blew up the Army Math Research Center, which was planning bombing missions for Vietnam. They killed a graduate student, and that helped end the anti-war movement. That and the when the Greenwich Village townhouse of the Weather Underground blew up, they were building a bomb. And Nixon ended the draft, which was a cynical way of getting students to stop protesting the war. But I was on the ground, you know, and I knew what was going on. Things were really getting out of control. And we just saw the Charlottesville fighting in the streets, and there was a lot of that in the 60s. You know, it was a bloody time, that Americans fighting each other in the streets, and we're kind of seeing more of that again.
Now, Joseph, this is kind of a personal question on my end. You've interviewed all of these great filmmakers, and we're talking about really about the 1970s. That's when, you know, I believe a propaganda film called the Apollo moon missions took place. Were there any filmmakers, Capra, Wells, or Ford, or anybody who you interviewed who privately told you that they suspected that that was not genuine but a propaganda film of the government?
No, I've heard those stories. I haven't seen any evidence of that. I mean, obviously there are these stories about Stanley Kubrick, but I think it's just fanciful, you know, story. But you know, I haven't seen any evidence. But the government puts out a lot of propaganda. I mean, I'll just give a funny example. My friend Gary Graver, who photographed The Other Side of the Wind, was in Vietnam. He was a Navy cameraman. He said he joined because he thought he could meet John Ford, and he never did. But he wound up in Vietnam. And so I said, what kinds of things were you guys shooting? He said, well, you know, if there was combat, we'd shoot it. But if there wasn't combat, they would stage battles just for practice and fun. And I said, what happened to that footage? He said, well, we'd send it back to Washington. I guess it's in the National Archives. So I guess there's some fake battle footage in the National Archives. So there's fakery and war footage all the time. And well, not all the time, but some of the time. And John Huston's San Pietro, for example, which is considered a great World War II documentary, a scholar discovered at the National Archives that most of that was staged after the fact, because Huston arrived about a week after the battle and restaged it with the survivors, and he had the commanders telling him what happened. And you can see the different takes at the National Archives. So documentary film is a complicated field. I've taught that, and you know, I tell students you can't totally believe everything you see. You should look at everything with a critical eye. And even when you're trying to be really honest and not interfere, just the fact that you have a camera there tends to change human behavior. You know, if people realize there's a camera, sometimes they don't realize there's a camera. For example, I'm in a film called Primary, which is one of the first American cinema verite films, 1960. It's about the Wisconsin presidential primary. I was a volunteer for John F. Kennedy, and there's some great scenes of him in public where he knew there was a camera, but you know, there were so many people there, and he was speaking, etc. He probably wasn't thinking much about the camera, but there's a great scene in the hotel room the night of the election where he's hearing the returns, and the cameraman was kind of inconspicuously off in a corner, and Kennedy seems very unguarded the way he talks and smokes a cigar and things like that. But he was aware there was a camera there, and that does change things.
Joseph, I respect your opinion, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are about, you know, there was blackmail as far back as Hoover against Martin Luther King, where they were threatening him to commit suicide. And I was wondering today, as Congress is, you know, not deciding whether or not we go to war and forgoing that responsibility, is there a chance they're being blackmailed by any surveillance systems or anything else?
Well, we have to assume all of our phone calls and all of our emails are recorded, and you know, internet traffic, etc., which is very disturbing because it means we don't have a Fourth Amendment anymore. And this is all due to 9/11 and the Patriot Act. And I tried to read the Patriot Act when it came out. It was about 350 pages. It's really almost impossible to read because almost every sentence, actually every sentence, has 3 or 4 footnotes and references to other laws and things. You could spend months trying to read this. And what's strange about that is it had to have 100 lawyers working on this for a year or two at least to get this thing written, and they had it all ready to go right after 9/11, and they passed it without Congress even having a chance to read it because they rushed it through, and it took away a lot of our civil liberties. And Peter Dale Scott, the historian, has written about continuity of government, which most people don't know about, which was an emergency plan that was put in place. Eisenhower started something like this during the Cold War because if the government was decapitated, they had to have a plan who was going to run the government. But Cheney and Rumsfeld, even when they were out of office, were working on this with Oliver North to suspend the Constitution. And George W. Bush put this into effect on 9/11, and he renewed it every year, and Obama renewed it every year. And they even put out press releases announcing it, but it was ignored by the media, of course. Continuity of government is a kind of a rewrite of the Constitution, and we don't know all the details, but it takes Congress, it guts a lot of the authority of Congress. For example, the Speaker of the House is no longer in the line of succession. So you have the president, the vice president, then you jump to the president pro tem of the Senate, who's Orrin Hatch, who would be third in line. And so I think a lot of the impotence of Congress is due to the fact that continuity of government is in effect. It's this permanent state of emergency we have, which is, rearranging our government. And so to get back to Hoover and all that, Johnson was a close friend of Hoover, and Hoover would feed him dirt on fellow congressmen, and he would use that to help get bills passed. He would say, well, if you don't vote for such and such, we'll expose your affair you're carrying on or whatever. And that was the low-tech version. And then they, with the kind of surveillance we have now, there are stories that Elliot Spitzer, who was forced to resign because he was frequenting prostitutes, they were using his credit card records that they got through this kind of surveillance. And so they can do all kinds of things with previously private records. There's no doubt that this probably goes on, and the media are compromised in many, many ways. So it's a disturbing situation that the government has this leverage over people. But it gets back to the fact that Congress doesn't declare wars anymore. So, now that Trump is threatening nuclear war with North Korea, which is our worst fear, and we worried about this during the campaign because he's so reckless and he's so ill-versed in world affairs, and he doesn't really believe in diplomacy much, and he's gutted the State Department, etc. Congress, there's some talk, can't we do anything about this? Well, they really can't. And there's a fine book by Gary Wills called Bomb Power, which talks about when the atomic bombs were dropped in 1945, that fundamentally changed our system because one man has the power to destroy the world by launching nuclear war. And Congress really is not involved. And congressmen are saying, senators, well, gee, we're supposed to have the right to declare war under the Constitution. Well, we've ignored that since 1941, for one thing, and Congress has kind of been derelict in their responsibilities. But one reason for this is because of the way nuclear war would happen, is if you had a credible threat of nuclear weapons coming from Russia or wherever it is, we'd have very short time to respond, and you wouldn't have time to consult Congress, et cetera, et cetera. And I've read scary stories that the time involved would be as short as 8 or 10 or 12 minutes. The president might have to make a decision. But of course, mutually assured destruction, MAD, as they call it, means that if we get attacked, we'd attack them, and then there would be this all-out confrontation, and the world would come to an end, or there'd be vast destruction. Korea is a small country, but they have nuclear weapons, and Trump is threatening to use our fire and fury against him. It's a very dangerous situation, and his aides have been trying to walk it back, but it's he's made these extraordinary threats, and we have to take them seriously. And some people say, well, you know, Trump likes to make threats, he doesn't carry out, he exaggerates, but it's different when you're president from when you're a real estate magnate, because when you put out a tweet threatening somebody such as Kim Jong-un, it scares other governments, and who knows what the reaction in North Korea would be. I've always thought the worst danger would be a miscalculation with smaller countries, because there are about 10 countries that have nuclear weapons. And smaller countries, in a way, it could be more reckless. But here you have the president of the United States. You know, we're still the leading power in the world militarily, if not economically. China's probably stronger than we are economically, but you know, we could act unilaterally, and there's not much we can do about it as citizens, which is extremely disturbing.
Bart handled this show so well, and I wanted him to, because he's versed in so much of this. But I just have one question. I'll throw it back to him here. Like, I'm not trying to say Obama, Trump, anybody, Hillary. I really don't like a lot of them much, what they've done, not as people. But under Obama, and I'm not comparing him to Trump and say, hey, who's better? Just under him, there seemed to be an awful lot of, hey, I'm going to be in for civil liberties, and I don't want to attack everybody. And to me, I've seen an awful lot of war under him as well. My point, not to attack him over the other people, but it seems the two parties don't have much of a handle on this at all. Am I correct?
Well, the Democrats certainly aren't putting up much of a front against them. There have been some individual senators and congressmen who've made strong statements, and even a few Republicans, but not enough. But there's been this kind of feeling of helplessness, which we have. And I'm old enough to remember the Cold War and how we were terrified of nuclear war back in the 50s, and the whole duck and cover ridiculousness at schools where we had to hide under our desks. But we were very anxious back then, and the threat was fairly strong. Although we had a much bigger arsenal than the Russians had, and we had Eisenhower as president, who was a very level-headed commander who really had seen war, and Khrushchev had seen war. And when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, Khrushchev and Kennedy saved the world together. Both were rather reckless in getting us into that confrontation over Cuba. But if you read the correspondence, for example, from Khrushchev to Kennedy, there's a very powerful letter Khrushchev sent on October 26th, pleading with Kennedy to we both seen war, let's stop it. And we both know that once you cut the ties of war, the terrible destruction ensues. It was a very personal, very anguished letter. And at the same time, the Khrushchev sent a second letter, which was more kind of conventionally threatening. And Kennedy's ex-com committee wondered which letter was the true Khrushchev, and they thought maybe the Politburo had made him send the harsher one. So they decided to answer the gentler one. And Robert Kennedy was sent to see Ambassador Dobrynin on Saturday, October 27th, about 7:15 p.m., with a message from Kennedy from the president that they had to have an answer right away, because the RFK said the military was forcing the hand of the president, trying to force him to have an invasion of Cuba, which was scheduled for Monday. And the president was not sure he could keep control of the military. He was worried that they might take over the government. And so that got the attention very strongly of the USSR, and Khrushchev capitulated on the 28th, the Sunday morning. And then the night before, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, said he wasn't sure if he'd wake up the next morning. That was the high point of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we're kind of in a Cuban Missile Crisis setting, but what's scary is that we have Donald Trump running things instead of John F. Kennedy, who, if you listen to all the tapes of the missile crisis, was very calm and measured, and had a group of advisors, and he listened to them very carefully, took all their advice. Some of them were hawks and some were not, but he would make a decision after taking stock of all the arguments, and he was constantly trying to de-escalate the crisis and trying to empathize with the other side. That's an important part of diplomacy is to understand the enemy and try to see it from his point of view. And but we came very close to nuclear war back then. But there's no steady hand in the White House, and who knows what's going on in North Korea. North Korea has, it's easy to say they're crazy, but we killed many North Koreans in the Korean War. Curtis LeMay, who was the head of the Air Force, boasted that he had killed 1/5 of the population of North Korea. We just bombed and napalmed them mercilessly, and so they were understandably very threatened, even after the Korean War ended in this stalemate. And so they developed atomic nuclear weapons to maintain their survival, which makes a certain amount of sense, although it's dangerous. And they're worried about being annihilated by us. And it's a terrible situation because South Korea is right next to them, and Seoul is a very large city nearby, and Japan could be affected by this. And any kind of nuclear exchange would be ruinous. And now we have, because of Trump, he read an article in the Washington Post. The Washington Post, like a lot of the media, has been putting out scare stories about how the North Koreans can send missiles to the United States with warheads. And I've yet to see evidence of that, because the farthest that I've seen reported that they've sent a missile is 600 miles. And the U.S. intelligence people publicly have disagreed whether they can miniaturize a weapon in North Korea, a nuclear weapon, to put on a warhead, to put on a missile. So all this talk about, they might hit San Francisco or Chicago, whatever, is exaggerated. So Trump read a story like that in the Washington Post, and at that meeting the other day said, we're going to send fire and fury at them. And, this was not what his advisors wanted him to do, although there was actually some confusion about that, because his press spokesperson said that he said it on his own, and there were reports of General Kelly, and he had discussed it. But you have this sense of a loose cannon running our government, and not the cool head that Kennedy was.
Joseph, I'd like to ask you one final question. I've been reading about whistleblower William Bentley, who worked for the NSA, CIA, and he said that the president's phone calls are being monitored, the Supreme Court justices' calls are being monitored, all of that in order for the CIA to steer the government in the way they want it to go. Truman, who created the organization, on his deathbed said he regretted doing it. There was no oversight, and that they are actually the ones running the government. What is your opinion about the CIA and who's really in charge, them or the president?
Well, yeah, that's a big question. I mean, we've known for a long time the CIA can't be trusted, and they were involved in a lot of clandestine activities overthrowing governments and involvement in the Kennedy assassination. So when people are saying, well, geez, the CIA thinks Trump colluded with Russia, we better believe them, I don't automatically believe them, obviously. On that case, I'm still waiting for a lot of evidence. We have some evidence, but not much. I'm waiting for Robert Mueller on that one. But there's this feeling I see from some on the left who are so frustrated by Trump that they would like to have the CIA basically depose Trump. That is dangerous territory, too. As bad as Trump is, and as threatening as he is to the world, once you start saying, let's overthrow the government, it's a very dangerous situation. The CIA during the Bush years, Bush-Cheney years, seemed to be often the voice of reason in the army, when Bush and Cheney were proposing invading Iraq and Afghanistan. They were the ones who were saying, well, wait a minute, this would lead to such and such and such and such. And they intimidated the CIA into going along with their WMD lies, which is a shame that the CIA went for it. And George Tenet seemed to have been quite corrupt head of the CIA. So they don't have a great track record, obviously, but they're leaking a lot, and I think that's helpful. When you undercut some of the rash things that Trump is trying to do, and there were leaks during the Kennedy years and Johnson years, etc. And a lot of these, there is some serious people there who really understand what's going on and have a much more sense of reality than Trump does, and that's useful. But overthrowing the government is not the way our system is supposed to work. And if if they overthrow the guy you don't like today, next time they'll overthrow the person you do like. So I think that's not the way to go. But I think there's ample grounds to impeach Trump on, at least on financial corruption. There's just a wealth of information. It's right out there in the open of his financial corruption. And I've always thought they'd get him the way they got Al Capone on tax evasion, that kind of thing. And who knows what Mueller will come up with. But I would caution people against automatically believing the CIA. For a long time, we heard that all 17 U.S. intelligence agencies were saying Trump colluded with the Russians, and then they had to revise it down to 3. And that's quite a big change. And people said, "Oh, okay, 3. I mean, let's get real, folks. Let's focus on hard facts here, and not just on leaks and speculation. They can be very misleading or self-interested. So we really need more hard facts and hard reality. That's what I hope the Mueller investigation will come up with. It. But who knows how long that's going to take. And at any moment, Trump could push the button. Like Nixon was, I used to be very nervous during the Nixon years because he got drunk a lot and would call up Henry Kissinger and say at 1 in the morning, nuke such and such a country. One time he called him and said, nuke Capitol Hill, which would have been suicidal. Fortunately, Kissinger didn't do anything about it, and the next morning Nixon would waltz into the Oval Office at 8 a.m. and would have totally forgotten what he said the night before. But who knows who Trump has around him who would restrain him in that sense. Some of these generals, people thought, well, General Kelly, General Mattis, General McMaster maybe are smarter than he is, but now you read that McMaster is one of the hawks in the White House, and Mattis issued a very chilling statement that we could destroy all the people in North Korea. So we don't really have a sense of level-headed people who understand the dangers of nuclear war and realize it could lead to complete annihilation. Trump made this chilling statement recently to Lindsey Graham saying, well, the people who would be killed there would be Koreans and, not Americans. But first of all, it's just not true. I mean, there are a lot of Americans in Korea and a lot of Americans in Japan, but what about the millions of people in North and South Korea? But if you start a nuclear exchange, the fallout will lead to nuclear winter throughout the world. And there's no nation that would be safe. It's just crazy to think that you can have a limited nuclear war. It's just not possible, and we've learned that over the years. I would say watch Dr. Strangelove again. That film, when I saw that in '64, the first time I saw it with a friend of mine named Dick Benka, I thought it was a serious thriller, and I was really scared. And then he laughed a lot through the film. He said, let's watch it again. Then I got the second time that it was a satire. And I came out of that theater a different person because it took away my respect for authority, and it gave me a real sense of how the world works. And while it's a satire, it's actually very realistic in terms of what could happen, how one crazy person can circumvent the system. The system is very vulnerable and flawed. So I would recommend people pull that one out again and watch it tonight. I'll probably watch it in the next couple of days.
Yeah, it's a great.
So we're in a scary
film.
time, and a lot of, yeah.
I wanted to say recently a transcript was released of Trump and I think the Mexican world leader. The only people who could possibly have a transcript of that is the CIA. So to me, it's so obvious it's the CIA who leaked that conversation. So why are they doing that? Why are they not thrown in jail, disbanded, shut down for doing such a thing? It's not their job to run the government. And yet, and they're getting away with doing it right out in the open.
Well, it could be somebody in the White House. I would imagine they'd have a transcript. Those transcripts were disturbing, the one with the Australian president, too. Yeah, it could be the CIA, and it is undercutting the president, but I'm a journalist from way back 1960, and I like leaks. I think that's one way we learn about what's really going on. Obviously, there are a few things that the media don't report on. which is troop movements. For example, you don't report that our troop ship is sailing toward a certain country, and you don't want to have people get killed. But if the president is having this threatening exchange with Mexico or Australia, we should know about this. So I'm glad they leaked that, and I'm glad there are people there who are trying to inform us, because we get such BS from the press usually. They print a lot of lies, and they avoid a lot of stories, and there's such a concerted propaganda effort. I just read a story that somebody did a study of Trump's statements. 20% of what he says is true. That's a pretty low bar. We used to think the president told the truth. I mean, we were wrong, but I remember being shocked when we found out that Eisenhower lied to us about the U-2. But he didn't always tell the truth either. But now it's assumed the president doesn't tell the truth, rather than the other way around.
Well, I think that's been the case for a long time, not just Trump.
Yeah.
If I can throw something in for 1 second, but I mean, who tried to off Kennedy, and who was Kennedy going to splinter into 1,000 pieces? And I love America. I love what it's supposed to stand for, and people could disagree with me, on issues. But if he wanted to splinter them into 1,000 pieces, then how much stronger have they gotten in the interim? And I don't trust anyone who's trying to overthrow the government for me, who's been capable of that in the past. And across parties, Jesus, we've dropped a lot of bombs under Bush, Obama, and there's been a lot of lies, and it's very hard for me to know who to trust.
Greetings, friends and countrymen. Welcome to Conspiracy Corner News special episode. We have a second interview. You can call it part 2 with Joseph McBride. He's an American historian, biographer, screenwriter, and professor in the cinema department at San Francisco State University. McBride has published 18 books since 1968, including acclaimed biographies of Frank Capra, John Ford, and Steven Spielberg. His most recent work is 2 Cheers for Hollywood, which we'll be talking about. And he has also done a lot of research on the President John F. Kennedy killing and of Officer Tippit, which we talked about last time being one of the forgotten murders of the day. Both of them contain really good insight and new information. The New York Times Book of Reviews causes JFK investigation a great knowledge of social and American history. Thank you, Joseph, for joining us. How are you doing out there in San Francisco?
Well, very good, Bob. Great to be on the show with you, and Bart. Good to talk to you.
And then Bob Wilson. He's an historian out in Long Island, New York. How are you doing?
It's an honor to be speaking to you two gentlemen today on such a serious subject.
Well, I'll let you start off, Bob. What is your first question you'd have for Joseph?
Well, Joseph's books have made me think. Not only his books sometimes can be on different subjects, but in a consciousness they can link together. And one thing he said to start the show was that I believe he was speaking of Freud, and he said what you're afraid to speak of, or what you don't speak of, is the elephant in the room. And I'd like to start the show off and kick it to you two gentlemen, because you've both spoken on these subjects, but it actually frightens me. The thing I'm afraid to speak about is these wars. Many of them seem to...
In the Vietnam, and then the weapons of mass destruction, and 9/11, all these things have problems connected to them. And we're still fighting in Afghanistan, the longest war in our history, which makes no sense at all. Although the New York Times a few years ago did a very revealing story that people sort of missed, that the reason we're in Afghanistan is that they have a tremendous amount of minerals there, including lithium, which is in your laptops and batteries. And that's why we're there. And we're usually, throughout human history, there have been a couple of reasons for wars. One is to steal the materials and the goods of other countries, and the other is to take land. And taking land is no longer as big a motive as it used to be, although, we're controlling Afghanistan as much as we can. Although I heard a speech by one of the former chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff a few years ago saying that there's no way to win a war in Afghanistan. The last person who did it was Alexander the Great. And he said basically it's not really a unified country. It's 27 different tribes, and the terrain is extremely difficult. And so you can't really win these wars. And I have a friend who's a veteran in Iraq, and he said his commander actually told the guys, we're not here to win this war, we're just here to hold on. So we don't win wars anymore, and we don't even try. That's a strange, antiquated concept that World War II was the last war we really won, and we lost the Korean War if you look at it from a strategic point of view. And it's interesting, World War II is also the last war we declared, and the reason that's in the Constitution is to get the public to support it. Why go to war if the public isn't behind it? Of course, then you can bring up the Goering argument. But in World War II, there was really a cause for it, and the public rallied behind it. It was just war, but we haven't had one since. Some kind of incident. And they reported that there was some kind of a firing going on of North Vietnamese firing on an American ship, and it turned out not to be true. There was some confusion about it, and it was later confirmed. I'm not sure exactly when this was all revealed to the public that it was fake, but it was quite some time afterwards, because Johnson was deceiving the public for years. That was part of the credibility gap, as we called it back then, that the public eventually realized they were being conned. And there was no real good reason for us to be fighting in Vietnam. It was mainly another economic thing, and it was cloaked in various patriotic rationales, such as defending treaties, etc. But it was all just to get money for the war contractors, just like people said about World War I. So the Gulf of Tonkin was a fraud, but the Congress passed a resolution. And only 2 senators, Greening and Morris, voted against it. A lot of them realized they'd been conned. So it wasn't a declaration of war. We never had a declaration of war in Vietnam, but it gave Johnson some authority to expand the war, which he began doing. In March of '65, he landed the Marines in Da Nang, and then it became much more overt from that point on.
Well, your expertise is in films. And I know you've done a book about Capra, and Capra was definitely, he was I believe, a World War II veteran, and he was contracted by Hollywood to make pro-military industrial complex films. So tell us about how the military industrial complex uses Hollywood, uses filmmakers to promote their war agenda.
Yeah, I've done 2 biographies about guys who had major roles in World War II. John Ford and Frank Capra.
Let me ask you about the Gulf of Tonkin. Tell us about that. I think a lot of people may not be aware of that, and also tell us about when that information was confirmed by the government itself.
Well, in '64, they were really gearing up for a war, and John F. Kennedy had actually started withdrawing troops from Vietnam. He realized that it was an unwinnable situation, so in the fall of '63, he actually issued an order to withdraw 1,000 troops, and he was telling his advisors that he would pull all the troops out after he won re-election in '64. But Johnson reversed Kennedy's policy on November 24th, '63, secretly, while the public was filing past Kennedy's coffin in the Capitol. Johnson was having a secret meeting and issued a secret presidential order to expand the war, not to withdraw. And he started putting out the word to McNamara and other people. That's what he was going to do, and that's why he was put in office. The people who supported him, the Texas oil people and defense contractors who were his backers, made a lot of money off the war. And Noam Chomsky wrote a book that attacks Kennedy. It's kind of wrong-headed in some ways, but he said that the conventional wisdom that we lost the Vietnam War is wrong, in the sense that the people who backed it made a lot of money off it, and that's from their perspective, they did really well. They won. Millions of people died, but they don't care about that, and so they always have that kind of a split going on. So the Gulf of Tonkin episode in August of '64 was a fake episode that they were looking for an excuse to widen the war more overtly, and they were sending provocative ship missions toward the coast of North Vietnam, hoping for...
Have been started under false pretenses, or a plan that seems to have been hatched before the war started, and it started with the WMDs. And I must admit, when those things were being bandied around, I was afraid, and I thought if that was true, it is a just war and we should do something about it. So I'm not saying I was a genius and I knew at the start that something was foul. And I'm just wondering, as these wars continue, and now they speak of Korea and they speak of China and Russia and these things going on. I know Joseph and yourself have studied this for so long, and that combined with, being afraid to speak about it, which is sort of, hey, we need to be in your computer, we need to be on your phone, we need to not only open your mail as in Hoover's days. I think you follow my train of thought. And I'd like to kick it to you two and just ask, where are they going with this? Is this just a train going off the tracks, or does someone in some sick way, are they pulling the strings and leading us towards some kind of a war that we'd like to, most of us in humanity would like to avoid, that reminds me very much of the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, I was reminded again of Hermann Goering's famous quote during the Nuremberg trials. The Nazi Air Force Chief Luftwaffe said that the common people in any country really don't want a war, and you have to get them to go along with it. And he said it's very easy to get them to go along with it. You just tell them we're under attack, and you attack the pacifists as disloyal, and pretty much you get everybody on your side right away, which is what has happened over and over again in my lifetime. I was born right after World War II, and I'm too young to remember the Korean War, but Vietnam War, was fought under false pretenses, and pretty much everything we've done since, you find out that it was some kind of event was rigged, like the Gulf of Tonkin.